The Wordsmith Forge Christian Fiction podcast was created to be devoted to authors of Christian fiction. In an attempt for the host, that would be me, to get a little comfortable doing interviews. I decided to do a practice interview. I thought it would be good if this first attempt was an interview with, I don't know, perhaps a curmudgeon. So I got the Chief Curmudgeon to agree to a sit down. He is not a Christian fiction writer yet, but let's see how it goes with the animation and all that I have planned. Well, we're glad that you joined us for this podcast. I'm excited to tell you that the guest is an old friend of mine. We have been friends for, how long has it been, Ken?
25, 26 years?
Probably, yeah. So we haven't really seen each other for 20 years, but it's great to have you on this podcast. Ken Arbogast is an interesting fellow that has a history an arm long of doing different things from his college years. Tell you what, I'll just let him explain it to you. Ken, tell us what you're all about. What got you to this point?
Well, Mike, thanks for inviting me to your premiere broadcast or podcast. I'm kind of excited for this opportunity for you, and I'm looking forward to hearing from some of the other authors. I had always really wanted to be a writer, and I had a chance to meet a couple of writers a long time ago, and what always struck me was how their life was kind of reflected in their writing. And I realized that, it's hard to just start writing if you don't have life experience. And boy, I got it. I
would say so, yes.
I joined the service, went into the Coast Guard after high school, and then after a couple of back surgeries, I joined up with the Forest Service and pursued that in a number of different states. And finally, when I retired from the Forest Service, I just decided that, okay, now I'm going to sit down and write a book that I had been planning and researching for 20 years. It was an idea that I had while I was stationed up in Kodiak, Alaska, and then I finally had the time to do it. And so that's what my first book was.
And would that be The Sorrow Ledge?
Yes, it's a story about a lightkeeper off the coast of Maine who served during the Civil War for the Union side and suffered pretty traumatic injuries and went home and kind of inherited the lighthouse where his father had served, and has a shipwreck on his island during a terrible nor'easter, as the storms are called up in New England, and he rescues the crew and passengers, and from there we start learning different views of what happened in the Civil War. And it really gets into the history of, immigration, of different ethnic groups coming to the United States and how they related to each other.
You had to do a lot of research to dig up all the facts, because I was really engrossed in in Sorrow Ledge, and your main man goes through a lot of stuff.
Well, having 20 years to research it, I did spend a lot of time reading histories. Tracking down histories was also a bit of a challenge because I didn't always have access to a library where those books were available, so I would frequently go online and purchase books, including things like the correspondence written by Joshua Chamberlain, who many people will remember was portrayed by Jeff Daniels in the movie Gettysburg. And he was just an amazing character. And for part of the story about his travels back from the war, I even purchased an old book that described the fares on trains that operated in New England. But I think that if you're writing historical fiction, it's important to have those kinds of details correct. And when I described the equipment and the weapons that his unit carried, I thought it was important that that I describe in great detail what exactly he carried and how that had such an impact on his unit.
Well, writers on, let me see if I can read this off my teleprompter here. Customers find the book well-researched and engaging. They appreciate the historical details and vivid description of events. The plot unfolds with slow, mindful deliberation, propelled by compelling characters. Readers describe the book as interesting, entertaining, and an excellent read with well-written and researched comment. And that's kind of what we were talking about, is the research that you did. And I was greatly impressed by that. I learned a lot about lighthouses as well. I learned a little bit about the Civil War, but I appreciated the detail that you went through, and you brought your character to life for me.
Well, I think that's the most important part of writing, is to provide the reader with a sense of, who that character is. And not just the main character, but all of the other characters need to be fleshed out in a way. They need to be real people who have their own motivations. And I think people need to have their own sense of humor. They need to have their own manner of speaking, because we all are individuals. And I think it's important to reflect that, to flesh out characters, not just as, narrators, but as people with flesh and bones and feelings, emotions, interest, hobbies, all of those things.
Well, I know he went, your main character, Ben, went through a lot of difficulties, and I was right there pulling for him. I said, how are you going to come through this one? So that was your first book, and your second one, The Pale Horse and the Unicorn. What a time sensitive, I guess. I don't know whether you call it time sensitive or not, but it was a book for the time. Would you tell us a little bit about The Pale Horse and the Unicorn?
Well, I hope that it won't be time sensitive. I hope that it will be a time snapshot of what a certain group of people went through during the first months of the pandemic of 2000, when a lot of people were challenged in different ways because we simply didn't know how to deal with something because, frankly, we hadn't had something similar in 100 years. You have to go back to just after the First World War for us to have that kind of broad challenge. And there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of misinformation, and everyone was trying to do their very best. And everyone had, again, kind of their own expectations of what to do to survive. And so I tried to take a lot of those different character motivations and put them into one little place in northern Michigan where I thought, now, here's kind of a microscopic view of something that was actually worldwide.
If you ever wanted to write a book that everyone worldwide could relate to, you certainly captured that, Ken. That was, and I guess that's what I meant by time sensitive. That was not the right word, but it certainly reflected that year, those 2 years especially. And I don't know of anyone that didn't want to kind of distance themselves from the possibility of catching COVID at that time.
And that was the motivation for several of the main characters, how to protect themselves, families, from what could be, a fatal illness. Because it was a significant complication for people with pre-existing conditions. And I think it raises the question of what would you do in order to protect a family member?
It was a good demonstration, real-life demonstration of the fight or flight. I mean, how could anyone fight that epidemic? So since you couldn't do that, we tried to flee from it or isolate ourselves. So I found the Pale Horse and the Unicorn very interesting in that it was a part of everyone's life going through that. Then we have my buddy, Marty. I really like Marty. We've talked about Marty some. I'll let you go ahead and introduce that.
Well, Marty is an active duty Coast Guardsman. He started his career as a rescue swimmer who jumped out of perfectly good helicopters to pull people out of the water. And he had some physical challenges and was no longer able to fly, and so he became a special agent, kind of a cop or detective within the Coast Guard, kind of a cross between the military police and the CSI. And Marty builds a reputation where he gets called upon for some really difficult task. And in this case, he's assigned to explore what happened to 4 Coast Guardsmen who disappeared from a boat in Lake Superior. And, obviously, thoughts about, well, were they deserting? Did they fall overboard? Was it in a storm? Kind of raises a lot of questions. And Marty goes up to Lake Superior and starts asking a lot of questions and trying to sort out how these 4 people disappeared without a trace.
And he does it very well by staying right in the box, not veering to the left or to the right. He's a by-the-book kind of guy that would never cross the line. Would you describe him that way?
Absolutely. Marty has a real flair for his own investigation style, and he probably has a little bit of an irreverent sense of humor that probably could get him into a lot of trouble at times, but he learns to keep it to himself, to respect, rank, and move within, the systems and different commands of the Coast Guard, and in order to really get as much knowledge as he can from people while also looking at different options, not laser focused on one thing, but trying to work out different theories of this terrible incident.
Now, I know that, let me say that Ken has been a big factor on my life as far as an author. And one thing he told me early is write what you know. Ken's time with the Coast Guard and the Forest Service, I know that has really given you a structure to work from, along with you write other things. I know you wrote things while you were with the Coast Guard, more, what were they? I don't know the title of them, but they weren't handbooks, were they? But reviews, things like that?
Well, I edited several publications. I wrote for the service. I wrote for external audiences. I actually just kind of worked on my craft. One of the people who kind of influenced me during my Coast Guard career was actually Alex Haley, who told me that write a lot and just keep practicing, write a little bit every day, and make certain that, you are improving the way you want to see your writing go. And for me, it's easier to write what I know. I'm sure, people who write science fiction or fantasy would disagree with me. They probably have just amazing imaginations, and I think that's wonderful. But I guess, being in several agencies, I'm just more of a pragmatic nature, and that's why I kind of fall back on my comfort zone. Well,
you have a breadth of experience that allows you to roam far and wide. When we met, you were the Forest Information Officer for the Wayne National Forest, and it may seem odd, but I think you needed to use a lot of creativity when you're writing whatever needed to be written, news releases and what have you, to put the federal government, the Forest Service, in the best light possible. Sometimes the people that read your work were perhaps not fans of the Forest Service, so you had to carefully craft everything that you wrote.
Well, and the same was actually true with the Coast Guard. We tend to think of it as, a do-good agency, but there would be times when we would maybe have to enforce drug laws, fisheries laws. When I was in the service in the early 80s, one of the big pushes was called zero tolerance, where we would enforce drug laws on the smallest amounts of illegal substances. And that was not a popular program with the public. And so we were constantly talking about, the reasoning for that and our approach, and in trying to incorporate that with things like our boating safety programs.
The last two books we talked about was Coast Guard Blue, that's Marty's first adventure that Kenneth brought to us, and then A Death on Bear Creek, which got an unusual twist at the end that kept me guessing all the way through the book. You had some interesting characters in both those books. Ken, you've moved around the country a lot. I guess you've lived in almost all of the eastern Midwest part. You lived in Indiana for a while, didn't you?
Yes, I lived in Indianapolis and then down in Bloomington when I went to school at Indiana University.
Right. And you have relatives in West Virginia and Ohio, and you've lived in Michigan and Minnesota. You get around.
Well, I hope that it's my sense of adventure rather than, the local neighbors trying to force me out.
Yeah, I can't imagine that. Well, where you're at now, just to give our viewers kind of a sense of Ken Arbogast, what's close to you in God's creation that you have an affinity for?
Well, I am back in the same county where I grew up, and I now live about 5 miles from a state park where my family would spend most of our Sundays. When I was young, my dad built his own boat. It was actually probably looked a little bit like a World War II landing craft because it was square and had like a swept up bow in the front. He had a motor that we could take to other lakes, but this little lake where I'm near is either a paddle or trolling motor lake, so it's very quiet. And we would take his boat out there, like I said, most weekends in the summer, unless we were going up to one of the lakes where he could put one of his big motors on. But that was just so much fun to have time because my dad worked so much. He worked in a steel mill from about 5 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and then he painted houses in the evening because he had the 7 children to feed. And so he had to, bring in good income. But on the weekend, he really enjoyed himself, And so that was nice, and we spent a lot of time. And I have been back to that same state park, and just sit and relax.
That's great. With all your personal experiences and the books that you've written, have you ever experienced any difficulty balancing your experience with your fictional characters?
Well, I guess there's probably a little bit of me in most of my main characters. Certainly Marty has a similar sense of humor and maybe a lack of respect for authority, which gets me in trouble at times. I was at one point, in fact, offered an immediate discharge from the Coast Guard because I expressed unpopular opinions. So,
tell.
It can be it can be interesting at times to you know, as you said, to balance, my personality and my characters in the Unicorn. There is, in fact, a public affairs officer who really kind of resembles my personality, simply because that was going to be one of the characters, and so it was easy for me to kind of insert myself into that situation and say, well, how would I react, and how would people I know react?
Yeah, sure. So what's one piece of advice for listeners who want to turn their own experiences into stories would you have?
I think the most important thing is not to be intimidated, because everyone is kind of, told, okay, you can learn to write. Well, you're probably writing verbally from the time you were 2 or 3. You just didn't take time to sit down and write it out. But you were expressing yourself verbally all that time. And so maybe think of how you speak as how you write, because then you don't bring a sort of artificial tone to it. That was something I struggled with when I was very young, was I always wanted to sound, sophisticated. Well, I'm not. I'm from Appalachia, and my earliest jobs were, I was a janitor and I worked in a meat market, and then I joined the service. I was enlisted in the service. I'm not, Gore Vidal or someone like that. And so in my writing, I don't pretend to be. I simply express myself.
I think that's good advice. I've kind of copied that somewhat based on your advice, I would say. It's much easier just to speak in your own vernacular and not try to present yourself at a different level than you are. I hate to say level, because who decides levels?
Right. It's not educational level. It's, as you said, vernacular. It's how you speak and how you're comfortable speaking. Now, I do have to add one caveat, and that is when I was writing Sorrow Ledge, I wanted to be certain to capture the language of the time. And so
right.
I went back and researched the language that was used in the Army, the language that was used in the lighthouse service. I even looked up how people spoke in parts of Pennsylvania and New York that the main character was going to travel through, because I wanted people to get a sense of those localities and how people spoke in different regions that I'm not certain we still have. I think we've become, a much more homogeneous society, probably because of radio and television and other cultural influences. But back in the 1860s, you spoke the way you grew up. And I wanted to make certain to reflect that. But there are great books about regional dialects, and an amazing study of the American language that was written in the 1930s and 1940s by a famous journalist named H.L. Mencken, and he gathered up all of the local expressions and jargon by state and by profession, and kind of captured a time period that we can go back and look at now and kind of understand where some of our expressions came from that seem kind of obscure to us today.
And people reading the book don't really understand what it takes to be authentic. And I felt that you were very authentic in that book. So, well, I think that's all the time we've got. Ken, do you have any remarkable things to say? Remarkable, I don't know if that's a good way to put it, but...
I rarely think that anything I say is truly remarkable. But again, I think that's how I speak. And I think, I my early years were in the 60s. And so, I learned a little bit of that, be yourself, be true to thyself, those kind of,
right.
Expressions. And I think for writers, authenticity is extremely important. Be yourself.
I think that's good words to remember. Ken, thank you so much for your time. Good talking to you again. And we'll see you on the flip-flop.
Well, thanks, Mike. I hope I don't have to write 5 more books to talk to you like this again.
Well, I'd just like to hear from Marty. So get number 3 going on Marty.
Oh, I'm working on him. But he's
okay.
Kind of slowing down.
I know what you mean. Take care.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. So that was my first trial run. I learned a lot. Like, as a host, don't say the things that your guest can say better. Don't worry about blunders, but if you have to go back and make a run at something again, make sure you pause long enough so you can edit what you don't want out and keep what you do want in. You need to leave enough space so you can smoothly edit things out. I do want to thank Ken for his participation. I will ask him if I can edit this production in a way he can use in his own endeavors. So give Ken's books a look. I've read them all and enjoyed them. I hope you will too. Now, obviously, some time has passed since I did the interview with Ken. I think it was in January. And now here it is March, getting close to Easter season, which is why I have this beard. I'm in our church's production, Lead Me to the Cross. It's an Easter drama, and I want to look the part. I play a Pharisee. Well, this podcast has 5 episodes out. I hope you will go look for them on YouTube, Substack, Spotify, X, used to be Twitter, iHeart, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. I encourage you to keep reading clean, and may God bless. Oh, and I'll be looking for Ken's protagonist, Marty, to have a road to Damascus experience like Saul of Tarsus had before he became Paul, Jesus' disciple. After that, we'll do another interview, and that's one interview you won't want to miss. Take care. Mike Baines, out.